Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I think we're all here, so let's call the meeting to order and make a start. And first, if I could profusely apologise for the half-hour delay this morning. Unfortunately, Air New Zealand is a bit dodgy at the moment, to put it politely, and cancelled my flight. So I ended up having to get it one that was an hour later, which just made that time frame just a little bit tight. But at least that plane was on time, so that bodes well for the rest of the day, hopefully. So this is a resource consent hearing for a proposed 4-lot subdivision at 372 Wanaka Highway, Wanaka, for Farrant and the estate of MC Farrant. So I think Jane and I are known to everybody on the call. Oh, sorry, I just got to clear that message, which I'm sure you all do as well. So, we are the independent commissioners appointed by council to decide on this application. Just in terms of housekeeping matters, I think we'll probably try and go through until about 12:30 or 1 o'clock, by which time we anticipate we should have come to the end of the applicant's evidence, and then have a lunch adjournment and then hear from the council officers after that. I think we're all familiar with how the process works, and we have no public attending the hearing, so I won't run through the order of the hearing. Everyone knows, but essentially we'll hear the case from the applicant. In terms of submitters, there is only one submitter, the Upper Clutha Environmental Society, and they have not responded to say whether they are attending or not, and they're not on the screen, so I'm assuming that they're not going to be attending the hearing in person. In terms of the council officers, we have Andrew Woodford, the senior planner. Andrew, at this stage, can I just ask, are you standing in for Sarah Gathercole this morning?
Yes, I am.
Good, thank you. We also have Lynn Overton, engineer, Chris McPherson, landscape architect, and Trish Anderson, who's providing the planning support today. We can note that we have had the agenda for this meeting, which includes the application, the assessment of environmental effects, the...
Oh, actually, I have to plug in. Oh, there was one here.
Oh, sorry, Trish.
Oh, bugger.
I think you might be on.
I'll just have it. See if I can go into the extension of the actual.
I can't tell you.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, Jane's just going to tell Trish here. She's not on mute. Sorry, one moment. She's actually in a different room from us. So.
We're on mute.
The joys of Zoom meetings.
Indeed.
Next. So yes, we've had the council's section 42A report and the accompanying reports with that, which can be taken as read. I'll just ask Mr. Woodford at this stage if there are any changes or addendums to section 42A report at this stage.
Not at this stage, no.
Okay, thank you. We can also confirm that Commissioner Sinclair and I carried out a site visit last Friday. Mr. Farrant very helpfully escorted us on that site visit, which I think was an excellent idea, as I know it's sort of not quite in keeping with council policy, but it's very difficult to undertake a site visit on a site like this, which actually has a lot of hazards and you need to know where you are going. So Mr. Farrant very helpfully guided us around the site. So we actually got a very good appreciation of the site. And then after we looked at the site, we actually drove down Black Peak Road and had a look from that area, and then drove up and sort of back around. So we feel that we've got a very good appreciation of the site and the receiving environment. In terms of procedural matters, we don't have any late submissions. As far as we're concerned, there are no issues with the scope of the application. We realise that there have been some amendments, but those appear to us to be within scope. I'll just ask at this stage if there are any other jurisdictional matters anyone wishes to raise at this point.
Not from the applicant's perspective.
Great, thank you. That's okay, thank you. So that's the introduction. So I will now hand over Ms. Hockley to you to make the case for the applicant. But I think at this stage, we don't have any queries in relation to engineering matters or services at this stage. So I'm just wondering, Ms. Hockley, if we need Ms. Overton in the room, or Mr. Woodford, if you would like to keep Ms. Is there anything specific that we need to cover?
No, we consider that the engineering matters are well dealt with through the 42A report and the application.
Yes. Mr. Woodford?
No, I don't think there's any. I think Ms. Overton had a query regarding a telecommunications easement along the lot 4. That was, I think, her only query.
Okay. Well, perhaps.
But perhaps we can. She probably there's no major outstanding issues, so perhaps we can just call it back in when required.
Yes, why don't we do that? Because we won't be discussing, I assume, Ms. Hockley, you're not going to be presenting any evidence on engineering, so we could deal with that as part of Council's response, if you're happy. Deal with that query.
Yes, we're happy with that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ms. Overton. Well, we'll give you probably be after the lunch adjournment, and we can ask you to return at that stage. Give you some time this morning to. I know we're all pretty busy at this time of the year, so.
Thank you, Commissioner. That suits me. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Hockley, I'll just pass over to you. And actually, sorry, we have had, thank you very much for sending through your legal submissions and the summary statements yesterday. That was actually incredibly helpful. So I made very good use of the time on the flight this morning, and I have read the legal submissions in full. So I suggest, and speaking with Commissioner Sinclair this morning, I think the main areas of interest for us would be for you to take us through the amendments to the application, and then through the relatively new provisions in relation to the landscape priority areas and the NPS for highly productive land. And we're sort of very interested in sort of your guidance on how we should assess the application against those two relatively new and untested planning instruments or parts of the plan, in my case, a higher order planning instrument. And so your submissions are very helpful, but I think we probably don't need you to read out the whole document if you're comfortable with that.
Yes, absolutely. I'm comfortable with it, and that sounds like a very good plan. And perhaps before I kick off, I'll just introduce who's in the room with me.
Yes.
So I'm Catherine Hockley, legal counsel for the applicant, and my co-counsel Mia Turner is also here taking notes. We've got the applicant and our expert team, so perhaps I'll just go around the room and you can introduce yourself.
Ben SB, landscape witness.
Morning, Mr. Espy.
Morning, Mr. Espy.
Morning. Blair Devlin, planning witness.
Morning, Mr. Devlin.
Morning, Mr. Devlin.
Morning.
I'm Gabriella Gloria. I'm just sitting in listening in.
Okay.
Good morning.
Morning.
And Mr. Ian Farrant.
Ian Farrant, who's paying for all this.
Morning, Mr. Farrant.
Morning, Mr. Farrant.
Yes, we're conscious. We'll keep it as brief as we can and focus on the issues, because they are discrete issues, so that makes it quite easy for them to be that focused. So.
All right, well, thank you. And I think that sounds like a very good plan for the legal submissions. We did file a bundle of documents with the legal submissions. Do you have a copy of that?
Yes, we do.
And that will likely be helpful as I take you through the amendments to the proposal. And then I did file one other document a little bit later in the day that we'd prepared for ourselves and then thought it might be helpful for you, which is just a map of the site and a few neighbouring properties that Mr. Farrant refers to in his evidence. So it looks like this. It's got yes. Yeah. So that might just be quite helpful for you to understand the neighbouring properties that Mr. Farrant refers to in his statement.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
I'll kick off by reading the introduction to my legal submissions that summarises the case, and then I'll move on to the key issues that you've asked me to address.
Thank you.
So this application is for resource consent to undertake a 3-lot subdivision with an additional lot for legal access. And consent is also sought to identify 3 residential building platforms. So that's 2 new building platforms and 1 building platform around the existing dwelling. And the purpose is to allow for the Farrant family to complete its estate planning. So it will allow Mr. Farrant to allow his 2 daughters to retain part of the family property, which they are entitled to under the estate. And Mr. Farrant will sell the larger 17-hectare lot to fund his retirement from the land. So currently Mr. Farrant attends site almost every day to check on things, and it's his intention that as he gets older, he'll spend more time in Wanaka town as opposed to attending the site. And evidence has been filed by Mr. Devlin, the applicant's planner, Mr. SB, applicant's landscape witness, and also Mr. Farrant himself, and they'll speak to those statements in due course. So in terms of the key issues for your consideration, these are essentially landscape issues and productive land issues, so the 2 points that you've already raised. And as you've mentioned, Commissioner Taylor, there's a recently notified landscape schedule in the district plan, which sets out essentially the landscape character of the relevant area and how the council intends to maintain that. So I'll talk you through how the proposal does achieve the outcome sought by that landscape schedule shortly. I guess when we're looking at landscape effects, the 42A report author agrees with the applicant that the visual amenity effects are appropriate. It's the landscape character effects that have been raised in the 42A report. So we'll get into that in more detail. And in terms of the NPS for highly productive land, it's the applicant's position that the proposal is generally consistent with this NPS for the reason that it largely maintains the productive capacity of the land as it's currently used. So Mr. Farrant has addressed how the land has been used in the past, how it's being used now, and looking at the surrounding properties that are a similar size to what is proposed, identifies that the uses of those properties are very similar to how the property is currently used. So we submit that there's no issue there, but I will take you through that in some detail in due course. So I think we can just jump past the receiving environment and the site parts to paragraph 16. And I just note here that the majority of properties directly adjoining the site have provided affected party approvals for the application. And you'll be aware of the provisions in the RMA that preclude you from having regard to any effect on those properties. And at paragraph 17, we just note that there is a limited permitted baseline with respect to the proposal in relation to farming activities, earthworks for the purposes of farming, and earthworks of up to 1,000 metres squared per year subject to standards. And it's our submission that there's no reason why you shouldn't consider that permitted baseline in your consideration of this proposal. Paragraphs 21 to 23 take you through the proposal, but you'll be well aware of those details. So I'll move on to paragraph 24, which identifies the amendments. And I'll use the bundle of documents to take you through these. So the amendments proposed are to address concerns raised by Ms McPherson in the landscape peer review and to address some of the landscape effects that she's noted. So the first is a reduction in the size of the curtilage areas proposed for lots 1 and 2. If we look at the landscape bundle, we just turn to page 5. This is the updated structural landscape plan. And you can see the reduced size of the curtilage areas shown there.
So can I just clarify that the measurements given there are the curtilage area, but do not include the building platforms, or do those totals include the area of the building platform as well?
They include the building platforms as well.
Excellent, thank you.
And can I ask a question, Ms Hockley?
Yes.
Our plan and our printing has kind of been cut off. Is there anything that we're missing? Our cut off doesn't include lot 3, and it just sort of slices down past the existing farm buildings. We're not missing anything with not having a full plan?
Yeah, yes, that's correct. So that is the structural landscape plan, which is focusing on lots 1 and 2.
Okay, thank you.
So the next set of changes from B to D relate to the planting and how it relates to the site. And I may leave it to Mr. Espy to talk you through that in more detail when he presents his landscape statement, as he'll be most qualified to address those and the reasons for them. And then finally, if we turn back a page, turn back 2 pages to page 3, an amended earthworks plan has been submitted. So this significantly reduces the amount of earthworks proposed for lot 1. And those earthworks were raised as a concern by Ms McPherson in terms of extent. Now, an important change here is the impact on the irrigation races. So in the original proposal, the irrigation pond and the majority of the races were to be filled in. As you can see on the new plan, that will no longer be the case. So this plan now makes it possible for those irrigation races to continue to be used intact. Now, there are some uncertainties about the ongoing future of that irrigation system, given the water permits that exist. So currently they expire in 2028. So there's been a number of renewals from ORC, and you will likely be aware that the water-related matters are going through review at Otago Regional Council, and what the rules and provisions will look like is yet to be seen. So whether that water take will be renewed is a question that we can't answer at this point.
Is the irrigation operational at the moment? Is it actually used at the moment anywhere on the property?
It is operational in the sense of the races. The use is.
We're not drawing down.
Yeah, my understanding is it's not used in any particular way at the moment. So the other point to note about the extent of earthworks is this has been a response to Ms McPherson's concerns raised, but Mr Espy, his view was that even as it was proposed before, the impact would not be significant once the earthworks were complete. However, the applicant was happy to pull it back regardless and come up with the current proposal. And we've already addressed the jurisdiction of those changes, but at paragraph 25, we just note the legal reasons for why those changes are within scope. Before I move on, are there any more questions about the amendments?
No, I thank you. That's very straightforward. Thank you.
We'll move on to paragraph 26, just to note that there are no operative district plan rules that are relevant to this proposal. And the key rules are in the proposed district plan, and under the proposed district plan, it's agreed by both planners that this is to be assessed as a discretionary activity. At paragraph 27, there is an earthworks consent requirement from Otago Regional Council, but this consent has been granted. And as you've already noted, the only submission on this proposal was from Upper Clutha Environmental Society, who has essentially raised landscape effects, and we deal with those as we go through the issues. So the next section of the legal submissions deals with the legal tests, which I won't take you through. There are a few points I want to make about those that are relevant to the effects assessment. So starting at paragraph 33, in a number of respects, Ms. Gathercole identifies that in her view, the application is contrary to a number of proposed district plan objectives and policies relating to landscape. I just wanted to highlight to you what the legal test for contrary is. And so the High Court has found that a finding of contrary requires a proposal to be opposed in nature, different or opposite, repugnant or antagonistic to the objectives and policies, and that needs to be considered when considering the objectives and policies as a whole. So it's my submission that that's quite a high standard to find in terms of an application. And I'll come back to that when talking about how this proposal aligns with the landscape schedule and how you should consider that in relation to the objectives and policies of the district plan.
Thank you. Just out of interest, and not suggesting that this is the case in this application, but if rather than contrary, if the proposal was inconsistent with a large number of the policies and objectives, how does the legal test work in that regard? As opposed to contrary. So as what you're saying is that if it's at the level of inconsistent, then that's a matter of, I guess, judgment for the Commission?
Yeah, so it comes into the broad assessment that you make under 104. Right. So if you find something to be contrary, that's a stronger finding under 104 1B as opposed to inconsistent. So that's merely the point.
Okay, thank you.
And I apologise, I've jumped forward a bit. There was a point at paragraph 32 that I just wanted to make. And that's in terms of the weighting that you give to factors under 104. Just the note that none of those factors take primacy over any other, and they're to be given such weight as you see fit in the circumstances. So that's when you weigh consideration of adverse effects against policies, etc. And I'll make a submission on how that impacts your assessment of the NPS HPL when I get to that, because I do think it's relevant in this case. So if I turn now to environmental effects, I just list at paragraph 36 the matters of agreement between the council and the applicant. And as we've already noted, that relates to servicing and subdivision matters, but it also relates to visual amenity effects and reverse sensitivity effects, which all planners agree are appropriate. And at 37, I list the positive effects agreed between Mr. Gathercole and Mr. Devlin. So the remaining issues are visual amenity effects and then landscape quality and character effects and the NPS HPL. So coming to your first key question, the relevance of the landscape schedule at paragraph 39. So as you're aware, the site is located within the Cardrona Mount Barker Road priority area. And the landscape values and absorption capacity of this priority area are now set out in the landscape schedule. This was notified and now forms part of the proposed district plan. So in that respect, it must be considered under 1041B of the Resource Management Act. And in this respect, it reflects the council's policy position on the landscape values and capacity of that priority area. And we submit, most importantly, how the limited capacity for rural living, which is identified in that landscape schedule, can be realised. So it provides guidance for you on that. And in terms of weighting, it hasn't been tested through the submission process yet, but it's my submission that because it represents the council's policy intentions for this priority area, it should at least be given weight to the extent that it would not be appropriate for the council or for you as commissioners to take a stricter approach to the landscape attributes of the priority area than the landscape schedule does. Because to do so would be inconsistent with the clearly expressed policy intention of the council. Now, at 41, Mr. Espy identifies that Ms. McPherson's landscape peer review is inconsistent or is more strict than the landscape schedule in a number of respects. Now, Ms. McPherson's an independent landscape expert and she's entitled to her views, but it's my submission that as the council, your decision must align with the policy intentions of that landscape schedule. And then I just note there that Mr. Espy's landscape evidence aligns with how the landscape schedule has rated the relevant values and attributes. And for this reason, under the current proposed district plan framework, I submit that Mr. Espy's evidence and conclusions should be preferred. And likewise, I identify that Ms. Gathercole's concerns set out in the 42A report about landscape effects are generally reliant on Ms. McPherson's landscape assessment. And for this reason, I say as a planner, Ms. Gathercole's opinion does not appropriately account for the council policy direction on the landscape schedule. Now, not to be unfair to Ms. Gathercole, at the time that the 42A report was written, the landscape schedule was in existence, but it hadn't been notified yet. So that was a reason for perhaps her opinion. But looking at it at this point in time, that landscape schedule now forms part of the PDP and does represent the policy position of the council.
Very helpful.
So I'm just going to quickly address effects, and starting with visual amenity, as I've noted, it's agreed that these effects are appropriate, and Ms. McPherson generally supports Mr. Espy's landscape assessment in this respect. However, she does raise concerns about the impact of the mounding against Black Peak Road in terms of public views. We simply note there that we have identified that Black Peak Road is not a public place, and therefore there are not public views from there. And at paragraph 45, we essentially summarise Mr. Espy's opinion as to why that mounding is not an adverse visual effect in terms of private views, and that's accepted by Ms. Gathercole. So that's just there for your information. So overall, it's agreed that visual amenity effects are appropriate. However, the issue was raised by Upper Clutha Environmental Society. However, in that respect, I submit that you should consider the expert landscape opinions on that point. And just quickly address landscape quality and character. To summarise our submissions here, essentially the applicant has adopted the recommendations of Ms. McPherson in terms of what amendments should be made to the proposal. And secondly, it's Mr. Espy's opinion that the proposal aligns with the intentions of the landscape schedule for how rural living is to be absorbed in this area, and he will discuss that with you in more detail. So overall, because the proposal reflects the landscape schedule and the intentions of the council, we submit that if a finding that the landscape character effects are appropriate should be made. Unless you've got any questions on landscape effects, I'll turn to the national policy statement on highly productive land.
No, I think that's fine. Any questions on?
No, nothing on
specifically?
that. No.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yes, that would be good.
I'll start at paragraph 56. So both the national policy statement on highly productive land and the partially operative regional policy statement, Otago regional policy statement, and the district plan seek to protect, retain and sustain the productivity of rural land and life supporting capacity of soil. As discussed in the evidence of Mr. Farrant, the productive capacity of the site is limited to hobby farming. And further, the proposal will not substantially change the way the site is used for productive purposes. And for this reason, it's our submission that the productive capacity and life supporting capacity of the site will be retained. And if I just jump forward now, I'm sorry, I am jumping around a little bit.
That's fine.
To paragraph 78.
Yes.
The NPS HPL came into force on the 17th of October 2022. And so because of this, it wasn't addressed in the applicant's AEE and was not addressed in the Section 42A report. The focus of the NPS is to manage certain types of development that typically result in irreversible loss and availability of highly productive land for land-based primary production. Now, I've put two documents in the bundle for you at tabs 6 and 7. And I don't intend to take you to them in any detail, but these documents set out the background of the NPS. So the first document at tab 6 was an introductory document discussing the concept of the NPS for consultation. And then this document at tab 7 is a more recent document from this year, which discusses the submissions that were received on the NPS and talks about the final recommendations of the Ministry for the Environment that led to the current version. So that might be helpful in terms of background and understanding the reasons why that policy statement has come into play.
Yes, thank you. That's really, we were discussing it this morning, actually. That will be really helpful.
So the intention for the NPS is not to provide absolute protection of highly productive land or to imply that there should be no net loss of highly productive land within any region or district. And it does recognise that non-primary production uses are appropriate in certain circumstances. So the type of production that it seeks to protect is agricultural, pastoral, horticultural, or forestry, where it's reliant on the soil resource of the land. And its purpose is to recognise that these production activities, which take place on highly productive land, do provide significant economic and employment benefits to the communities that surround it and collectively underpin the value of the primary sector. Now, as set out in the evidence of Mr. Farrant, this site does not provide significant production, economic or employment benefits to the community.
So is there a definition of what they mean by productive or production? I mean, if they say protect production from agricultural, pastoral, horticultural, forestry, is there any guidance as to what production is meant? I mean, for example, does it have to be is there a sort of economic consequence to that, or?
So the way that the policy statement works, and perhaps I'll take you through it, is in the bundle as well at tab 5, so page 12. So there's a set of policies which are at page 18. The way that these policies seek to protect highly productive land, or essentially functions in two ways. First, focusing around the definition of highly productive land and what that means, which I'll take you through. And then focusing on the type of development that can and cannot happen. So the key policies for us are policy 7 and policy 8. So the subdivision of highly productive land is avoided except as provided in this national policy statement. And secondly, highly productive land is protected from inappropriate use and development. And I will take you through why we submit the proposal is consistent with these policies in this case. So the policy focus that's relevant to this provision doesn't focus on the meaning of primary production and actually focuses on what is allowed to happen on highly productive land. The second thing to just make you aware of is part 3 implementation, so which is just over the page. That part gives guidance, both how the NPS is to be implemented by councils, but also how these policies are to be interpreted. So in that respect, clauses 3.8, 3.9 and 3.10 are relevant to the interpretation of the key policies.
Sorry, Ms. Hockley, did you say that 3, 8, 9 and 10 were the key policies?
Were the key clauses that inform the interpretation of policies 7 and 8.
Okay, thank
that
you.
I say are the key policies.
What about 3.7? Is that relevant? Avoiding rezoning of highly productive land for rural lifestyle.
Yeah, I thought the same when I first looked at it, but that's a rezoning focus.
Oh, yes, it is.
And it's rural lifestyle as well, which is defined in the most recent guidance document. So at tab 7, it's identified that is intended to mean lots of, I think, 2 to 4 hectares. So if you think of the rural lifestyle zone and the PDP, that's what that policy is about. Oh, sorry, that's what that explanation clause is about, which links back to policy 6.
That makes sense because it definitely says rezoning, and then the next one, 3.8, is avoiding subdivision.
Yeah, yes, that's correct. So as I mentioned before, the key trigger to this NPS is the definition of highly productive land. And at paragraph 80, I note that the NPS directs regional councils to map highly productive land in their regions within 3 years. However, until this mapping has been carried out, highly productive land is defined as essentially LUC classes 1 to 3 within a rural zone. And so, again, if I take you to the bundle and we go to tab 2 or page 2, what we've done here is overlay the LUC maps with the subdivision plan. And you can see through the centre of the site, the peninsula of land noted as class 4. So that part of the site is not within the definition of highly productive land. And then the dark green around the edge is identified as class 3. And so that is defined in the NPS as highly productive land.
Interesting. So how were these LUC classes established initially?
Yeah, and that's actually what I want to take you to next, which is in the very next paragraph. So we're on the same page. Now this system has a number of limitations, and that is acknowledged in the guidance documents in this bundle. So, apologies, it's not the next paragraph, it's paragraph 83. Nice. A number of limitations. So these LUC maps were developed in the 1970s and 80s. And they have not been updated since. And in my submission, this aligns with Mr. Farrant's evidence, where he identifies he hasn't noted any difference between the areas on the site that are class 4 and that are class 3. So in terms of reliability, given the dates that these were produced, there are some questions about that. And over the page, the councils have been directed to carry out more up-to-date mapping than the current LUC map. So as part of this NPS process, regional councils will have the ability to do a more detailed study and in fact update these maps to ensure they're accurate given their age. Other question marks about this system are that there are discrepancies between how the regions have in fact applied this mapping at the time that it was developed. So it's possible within some regions what is class 3 could have been tested differently than others.
Right. Okay. So does the class 3 relate to a certain soil type that is capable of producing some kind of, I don't know, biomass or something from the site? Is that how it works?
My understanding is it relates to the limitations in the particular soil. So rather than being soil type, it's about limitations. So things like erodibility, climate, etc., to develop these, and that is all addressed in the guidance documents. And Mr. Devlin also has a paragraph on that in his evidence as to how these maps were developed. But yeah, essentially, if we think of LUC1 as having the least limitations for productivity and LUC8 having the most limitations, and there are sub-limitations within that. So in this case, the class 3 land is subclass 3S, which means that it's a class 3 and its key limitation is soil quality. While another example could be class 3E, which would mean that its key limitation would be erodibility, something like that. Yeah, as I said, Mr. Devlin's got some detailed paragraphs.
We did read that, but that makes that explanations really helpful because it sort of puts the context around it.
So when the councils are required to produce regional maps, they will need to account for where the classifications are in relation to property boundaries, which will result in not having this situation where we've got half part of the site with a different class. So they'll have a decision to make as to whether or not to exclude the site entirely or include the site entirely within class 3 or within the highly productive land definition.
That's interesting. So it's going to be site specific to effectively cadastral boundaries as opposed to the underlying quality of the soil.
Yes, cadastral boundaries in relation to geographical areas. So they'll take a bigger picture as well, and where you've got a large geographical area and there's a small part of the site that hasn't been mapped in the same way, that may mean that it would be included. Likewise, if there's a small island of highly productive, it might be excluded, but that's entirely up to the discretion of the councils at the time. And finally, councils are also entitled to consider other matters than just the LUC system when defining whether something will be highly productive in their regional policy statements, such as property size, climate, etc. So, and finally, once this exercise has been done by the regional councils, they will then have to notify their maps under Schedule 1, and it will go through a public submission and RMA testing process.
Right.
So the point of my submissions there is simply to note that these maps are rather old, they're very, very high level, and they will be tested rigorously over the next 3 to 5 years, which is likely to result in quite some differences to what we have now. And it's my submission, going back to the legal points I made about 104 earlier, in terms of the amount of weight that you want to give to each limb of 104, it's my submission that the limited reliability of these maps and the potential for these maps to change in the future can be considered when you think about how much weight you want to give to the NPS against all the other factors in this process. So we do have the policies and they are important, but I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that there is still a process to go through here, and it could result in quite a different outcome. I'll just check that I haven't missed anything important. So if I just take you back to the NPS for one moment, I talked about the key policies. And so, as I said before, policies 7 and 8 are key here in terms of the land use of the building platform and the subdivision. And clauses 3.8 to 3.10 provide you with an explanation for how to apply those policies. Now, what I wanted to highlight for you is, in my submission, a key exception. So policy 7 states that subdivision of highly productive land is to be avoided except as provided in this national policy statement. And 3.8 talks about how to apply that policy, and there's an exception at 3.81a that subdivision must be avoided unless the applicant demonstrates that the proposed lots will retain the overall productive capacity of the subject land over the long term. So you've got Mr. Farrant's evidence as to how the site has been used in the past and is being used now, and also the examples of how lot sizes similar to that proposed can be used in the environment, and identifying that the use is very similar. So it's our submission that this exception applies, that the productive capacity of the site will not be undermined by the proposal. And a key reason for that is the size of the lots. So we're not talking about 2 or 4 hectare lots here, which would be more of a rural lifestyle type development. We're talking about sort of 23 acre lot sizes, 40 acre lot size, which is still essentially large enough to be a hobby farm, which is what the site's currently being used for. And Mr. Devlin provides quite a comprehensive assessment of the objectives and policies of this statement in his evidence, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any other questions. Now, I've jumped around a bit, so I might just run quickly back through my submission to make sure there were no more key points. There are 2 points which I did skim over that I would like to come back to. At paragraph 66, and I'm sorry, I'm jumping back to the landscape schedule. I think I got a bit excited about talking about the NPS. So if we're coming back to the landscape schedule, and you'll recall my submission that this landscape schedule reflects the council's policy position in terms of how this priority area is to be developed moving forward. And I just note, back to the point about contrary, that Ms. Gathercole's assessment under the PDP is that the proposal is contrary to a number of landscape objectives and policies. And it's my submission that the proposal achieves the outcomes sought by the landscape schedule, and therefore it would not be correct for the commissioners to find that the proposal is contrary to the objectives and policies that this landscape schedule intended to give effect to, where the proposal is in line with the schedule, keeping in mind that high bar for a finding of contrary.
Thank you.
And just a final point of clarification that I wanted to make in relation to the 42A report. It's at paragraph 67. Ms. Gathercole states in the 42A report, when talking about the proposed district plan, that there's an expectation that land within the rural zone will be used for rural productive purposes, and that the proposal is not consistent with this purpose because it introduces more rural living into the zone. But I submit that this statement is not a correct integration or interpretation of the objectives and policies of the rural zone. And in particular, objective 21.2 makes it clear that a range of land uses are to be enabled within the zone subject to managing effects. So it's my submission that in terms of objectives and policies, that's the key framework around the rural zone. Is it a effects-based policy framework as opposed to identifying specific land uses that are required? And there's a number of objectives and policies talking about how rural living is to be managed, and they focus largely on maintaining and enhancing the landscape values. So unless you've got any other questions, those are my legal submissions. And again, I apologise for jumping around.
No problem. And we sort of invited you to do that. So it's absolutely fine. I just have two that sort of have arisen, and they were sort of questions that I had generally. But the first one relates actually to the point you were making about the exemption under 3.81A. That demonstrates the proposed lots will retain the overall productive capacity. I guess, so if we accept that the land is going to be, is available to be continued to be used for hobby farming or of the nature of the activities that currently exist and that currently exist on the neighbouring properties. How relevant, I mean, how much confidence do we have to have, and how do we, I guess, is it necessary to ensure that that continues by way of sort of introducing a consent notice or something to give effect to that? I'm just interested in your view on the legal position there, in terms of, we sort of, if we accept that that argument holds, how do we have the confidence that that is actually going to be given effect to?
I guess it's sort of a practical point that if this land is not grazed or used as it currently is, it's a very large, they are still very large sites for a sort of a single family to manage. And if it's not going to be used for this sort of the hobby farming that it is now, it would be difficult to know how or it would be difficult to maintain the site, I suppose. I mean, if it's just going to be left ungrazed, it would very quickly become unruly. And Mr. Farrant has talked about that in a bit in his evidence, in the sense that he does have a grazer on there at the moment because he isn't able to spend so much time there and manage it himself. He has had to bring on other productive uses to ensure that it's maintained. So my initial submission would be that something like a covenant wouldn't be necessary because of the size of these lots. It might be different if you were talking about sort of 2 hectares where someone might want to get out there, ride on lawnmower, but I can't imagine that that would be practical in this situation. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look around the district, there are some examples of actually even larger properties where land has been taken out of productive use, and with large areas being mowed or turned into large gardens, and that kind of thing. So that sort of was running through my mind. And I guess the other thing, and Mr. Farrant might want to address this when he presents his statement, but I did notice that the word "is likely to" was used quite a lot in that statement, and the one that was in the statements of evidence. So that was, but
I guess the other point that can give you confidence is the conditions around the curtilage areas. So there is a proposed condition, and Mr. Devlin would be able to take you through the wording of that. It does restrict what can be done. Essentially, when you're talking about large gardens, that struck me in terms of how that condition is worded. But this is certainly something we can give a bit more thought to, I think, in context of that curtilage condition, what it looks like, and the questions that you've just asked.
Yes, I mean, the question that was running through my mind was, is this something that given that we have now got the HPL, where a consent notice condition might be appropriate, but again, it's this is very new. I mean, prior to this, I wouldn't have thought that was a necessary condition, but it's and I haven't really given any more thought to it, but it is sort of I guess a live issue.
Yes, we might need to give that some more thought as well.
No, understand. My other question was just in relation to the receiving environment. Actually, I'm sorry, I should have asked this when you were talking about the receiving environment, but I think it was Mr. Devlin's evidence mentioned that the property, I think it's the Timu property, which is down on the valley below, that there has been a consent notice issued. Consent order, so that Commissioner Sinclair and I were the original commissioners on that application, which we declined, and then there's now been a consent order issued for that subdivision, and I just was interested in how that might impact on this application from a legal perspective, in terms of, I guess it raises issues of fairness and precedence potentially. And if you haven't thought about that, that might be something that you would like to address as well.
Yes, yeah, I will give that some more thought, but my initial response would be that was quite a different type of application, and
Yes.
the lot sizes were very small. And we went down there on our recent site visit. It looked like there was a slab being prepared, and those houses are very close together.
Yes.
I wouldn't describe that as a rural living development. While what we're proposing here is quite squarely rural living.
Yes, I agree with that. I just wondered whether, you know, it's, I mean, because we still have the same landscape, we're still in the same landscape priority area. We've got a lot of the, I mean, we're still in the rural character zone. So it's, yeah, it's sort of, at one level, it's in terms of what has happened is quite different, but in terms of the, I guess, the objectives and policies of the plan, I think it is the same, isn't it, Jane?
Yes, it is.
Yes. So it's sort of looking at it from that perspective, I suppose.
Yes, the fact that something of that lot size was granted. Yes, I guess there's a sort of that precedent question, and then the cumulative effect question. That also might be helpful. Mr. Espy can address that from a landscape perspective as well, which might help.
Yes, and Mr. Devlin might want to address that as well from a planning.
Yes, yeah.
So I just thought I'd just raise those two, but I'll hand over to Commissioner Sinclair.
Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Hockley. My Commissioner Taylor's actually asked some of my questions, and I do have the same concerns about the amount of times I read is likely to be maintained, that rural hobbiness. So I had exactly the same questions, and I'd like to know what assurances we have as commissioners on how that is going forward for us. The other question I had was just on the only one that's left, and your submissions have covered a few of mine. And the only one was left, there was just, I saw that there was some private covenants registered on the title, and I just wondered what they were and if they were of relevance to us.
Yes, and I can't answer the question specifically, but we did look into them, and there was nothing of specific relevance to this application. There were
that they were provided with further information response, and the council's not party to them.
Yes, so they were private covenants, and Mr. Devlin has just reminded me that they were provided to the council as part of an RFI response, which I have here, so I can give you the date. So Vivian Espy provided details on the 17th of May, identifying what those covenants are, simply noting that they're both private non-objection covenants, and that QRDC is not party to either.
Okay. I do recall something like that in the Timu one actually came up.
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
Thank you. That we can find those.
Yes.
It'll be in our bundle. And that was all the questions I had for you, Ms. Hockley. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll now bring Mr. Farrant up to sit where I am to speak to his summary statement and answer any questions.
Thank you.
I'll swap places.
Morning, Mr. Farrant. When you're ready.
What do you want me to do, Catherine? Read it.
Read.
I'll just read briefly the submission that I put a little bit more on it earlier.
Yes.
This may appear rather formal. In particular, I forgot to put a tie on.
That's all right. We haven't got one on.
My full name is Ian Ferguson Farrant, and I am the owner of a half share of the site, which is subject to this application. In this statement, I provide a summary of the key points of my evidence. We've applied for a consent to subdivide the 36.27 hectare property, 372 Wanaka Highway, into 4 lots, 3 for residential purposes and 1 for access. There's an existing house on the site that I lived in until June 21, as well as farm and other buildings. The remainder of the site is currently used for low intensity cropping and grazing, and the grazing's by a local farmer who's just put what I thought were a few wethers there, but it turned out it was a few lambs. I purchased the site in 1994 as a hobby farm. At that time, I was chairman of Fulton Hogan and was closely involved in the rural fishing and agricultural business community. At the time, I was looking to move towards retirement and find an interest to spend the time on. I lived on the site until June 21, when I moved into the Wanaka Township. At 81 years of age, the physical work needed to maintain the property effectively is seriously beyond me. My experience with the conditions of the site over the 28 years, it's very dry in the summers, requiring significant irrigation and fertilizer. Ongoing irrigation rights for the site are currently subject to considerable uncertainty due to the reviews by Otago Regional Council. This basically goes back to the mining rights. And ORC have struggled over quite a long time how to handle those, and they've just pushed it out, as Catherine said. It cannot be grazed unsupported in the winter. By that I mean without baleage or feeding out, due to zero growth during the winter. It has experienced significant rabbit issues. I spent $18,000 in 2022 this year to remove rabbits, and already they're coming through the gate. It hasn't produced a profit despite extensive use of the fertilizer and irrigations and other inputs. As my purpose for the site was to maintain it as a hobby farm, rather than turn a profit from the land, I was happy to spend money on maintaining the productivity. However, in my experience of the land and the conditions, I do not consider that it would be an economical, viable, standalone, productive piece of land. The current production use of the site consists of 6 hectares planted in barley. This is the first time we've had a go at barley, and a local farmer grazing the remaining land with sheep and beef cattle. During the current spring, there is sufficient growth, and the stock consists of approximately 100 wether sheep and 20 beef cattle, as I believe there were when I made my submissions. However, there were no stock on the property at all over the winter, as there was no grass growth. Stock numbers fluctuate according to the grass available, and of course they can bring in and out new stock. Also, I have got the pet donkey and his 3 sheep companions on the property, and they stay there all the year round. The purpose of the subdivision is to allow our family's estate planning. It will allow my 2 daughters to effectively take what they are entitled to under their late mother's estate by retaining 9 hectares, 23 acres lot each, while the larger 17 hectare lot would be sold to enable my retirement off the land. I do not expect the productive use of the land to substantially change after the proposed subdivision. The proposal is for 2 lots of just over 9 hectares each and 1 lot of over 17 hectares. Lots of these sizes can continue to be grazed by sheep and beef cattle or planted in crops such as barley and lucerne. I am aware of neighbouring lots of approximately 8 and 12 hectares that are used for productive purposes of growing lavender, which is actually only a tourist operation. The lavender supports the tourist operation, barley and lucerne. And the barley is on, I've called it 372A Wanaka Highway, but it's got a better address somewhere off Black Peak right away. I expect that the proposed lots from our subdivision would be used in a very similar way. I understand that the site falls within two classes of land use capability, being classes 3 and 4. In my hobby farming of the site, I have not noticed any difference in the soil conditions or land productivity that aligns with class 3 or 4 designated areas. And of course, it's something until we're looking at this exercise I would have had no idea about.
No. I think those, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just turn to Commissioner Sinclair. Any questions?
Yeah, I did have just a couple of questions, Mr. Farrant.
Yes.
I just wondered if you would like to take us through the photos that you had attached to your
As
and just the significance of each photo and the point you're trying to make with each photo.
That'll be interesting since one of my daughters put these photos in. I think photo number 1 is just looking across at how dry the whole countryside is in the middle of summer.
Okay. Right.
Or towards the end of summer. Photo number 2 is just showing how rough and unproductive parts of the land are. Which happens to have 2 cats on it.
I know. They're wild cats, aren't they? They look like it.
One of them, yeah, the far away one would be the other ones. Oh yeah, that black cat's wild too, I think. I think they might have both disappeared recently.
Right.
We're not allowed to talk about that.
Okay.
Photo number 3 shows you when rabbits sit outside your front door, they are in large quantities if let go.
I have this exact same photo at my house at the moment. I think I counted.
Isn't it annoying?
It's incredible. That's out of control at the moment. It is annoying. Yeah.
But it does make the land less productive.
Oh, absolutely.
Productive.
Yes.
And you've got a horde of rabbits chomping their way through it.
Yeah.
Digging underground tunnels. I think 5 is just to show that it's pretty poor quality land. Now, did I have any more?
I think that was, oh no, you do? You just got one by the pond.
Yeah, by the pond. Oh, that's just again showing that it's not much land. And I've no idea why they've got the measuring tape out there.
Okay.
Then there must be more rabbits because everyone's been fixated on rabbits.
Rabbits.
That's just a shot of Mount Iron showing that, it's not all green grass all year.
It looks like a winter photo.
Yeah, it looks like a winter photo. Yeah, August.
Oh yeah, August. Yeah. So it's that just shows what the.
I think the point of putting some photos in was just to back up that it's not that productive land that ought to be in whatever class 3 means.
Yes.
And secondly, that it is difficult to farm.
Yeah. If it wasn't farmed in any of the uses that you've mentioned, is there, with your background in the agricultural sector, is there any other uses that you can think of that the land could potentially be put to?
No, in my view, I can't think of anything other than grazing it. It was part of a huge farm when I bought the first lot of property. And it was just quite poorly grazed as part of that large farm. And I've always said as a hobby farmer, we probably have increased the value of the productivity of the land by pouring a lot more into it than a normal, large farm would do.
Yes.
So if you go back to when I bought it nearly 30 years ago, it's probably a little bit more productive now.
Right.
And will continue to be so. The obvious use is either lucerne, grazing, or I'm hoping barley, but the barley was sprayed with a helicopter the other day, and it's now starting to become a rather uneconomic operation.
Right. By the time you need a helicopter, and yes, and
Yeah, because you can't run over it with the normal spraying gear.
Ah, okay.
I hadn't thought about that when I put it in barley.
I just had a couple more questions, Mr. Farrant.
Yes.
One was the existing flat on lot 2. What was the intention for that in the future? Is that to remain as a flat? Yeah. Is it the farmer sheds? Is there a flat in the farm shed buildings?
In the building down on lot 2?
Yeah, I'm not. I thought. I
From time to time, people do sleep in that side of the barn, but it's not permanent.
There was it was referred to in the conditions, something about water supply to the flat, and I just wondered if it was to remain just as it currently is for workers' accommodation.
No, it'll just remain. I would imagine it'll just remain as it is. From time to time, it's got a toilet and shower, and from time to time, people would sleep there, but only if there's no room at the house.
Right. Okay. And the last question I had was just going back to the questions that Commissioner Taylor asked, if you had thought about some sort of legal instrument to protect the grazing of the land or the openness of the site. Had you any thoughts on that?
I'd be uncomfortable with that. I guess that's because of a more elderly person. I think the protection there, subject to other people agreeing, is that if the use of the land is to change after this is consented, then you've got to come back for a consent hearing anyway. So I'm just reluctant to say into the future that someone has to farm it in a particular way. Do they have to grow carrots or try and grow carrots or whatever? And if the use of the land was to substantially change, then we'd be back before commissioners for a hearing. So I think, in my view, but I'm not a lawyer, I think that is sufficient protection. I'm looking around because I've got my back to my team, looking around for a bit of support here.
I'm sure you'll be able to have a discussion about it. Yes, I hear what you're saying on that point. If water was available for irrigation purposes, and I understand the complexities around the water rights issue, would that make a difference to the productive capacity of the land?
No, because all of this land has been subject to the 3291 water race concession.
Yes.
Which is the one that is under is the one that's under threat. And of course, we're all the people on that are maintaining that because it can be considered a valuable resource.
Yes.
We're about 8 kilometres from the intake. We're at the end of it. And it requires good management by everyone. At present, I'm not too worried about doing anything with it until we get through this position, and then the children can make their own call on it.
Right.
But we have been using it at that end of the property.
Yes. So no, that makes
it's very labour intensive, as you might gather.
Well, yes, I know. I mean, when you're describing it, it almost sounds like you're handing on a liability in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I've got to support the rest of them on the race.
Yes.
It's only fair.
Oh, sorry. Yes, no, I was talking more generally about the land, because it's not economic to farm, and that there is a cost associated with actually maintaining it in its rural, the rural character that it currently demonstrates.
But it would be easier if this goes through to maintain it without a doubt.
Right.
Because it'd be two other families pouring their money into it.
Yeah, that's sort of where my thinking was going. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see.
Right, we'll have Mr. Espy next. So Ian, thank you.
I'll get out of your way.
Thanks, Commissioners. What I thought I'd do is read my summary statement. And then I thought I might take you to, I know there were some questions about the priority area schedules and those provisions. So I thought I might make some comments on those, just to preempt questions maybe, and then go from there.
Thank you.
So just to recap slightly, I prepared the landscape and visual effects assessment report that went in with the application, which was February. Then I prepared my evidence 14th of November, and then yesterday the wee summary statement. So those are the three documents from me. Going to my summary, I'll skip the introduction bit and I'll go down to paragraph 5. The site is within a rural character landscape and is within priority area 2123-1, which is the Cardrona River, Mount Barker Road, rural character landscape priority area, which is characterised by open farm pasture with rural living and hobby farming incorporated into it. In the relevant vicinity, a rural living enclave is located to the immediate west of the site, accessed via Black Peak Road, which is a private road, and that's the group of rural living properties that includes the Timu property that you were talking about. So the proposal will create 2 9-hectare lots and 1 17-hectare lot. The 17-hectare lot contains the site's existing dwelling. A building platform will be created on each of the 9-hectare lots, each platform being surrounded by a curtilage area within which all domestic activity shall be contained. And there's a proposed condition about that, and Mr. Devlin can take you to the exact wording of that. Proposed structural landscaping in the form of earth contouring and areas of planting will assist in visual screening of the building platforms and the curtilage areas. Since the time of notification, the extent of the proposed earthworks has been significantly reduced, as we've heard, and the conditions of consent that were recommended by Ms. McPherson have been adopted. Adopting the recommendations of those conditions has resulted in, and this is just a quick summary, a reduction in the size of the curtilage areas, pulling back the curtilage areas from the terrace edge, changes of the mix of planting on proposed lot 2 to include high native species, and changes to the amenity trees to the south of lot 2 to include evergreen species. Notified priority area schedule 2123-1 now forms part of the proposed district plan. It sets out the values and capacity of the relevant rural character landscape. Landscape values are described as moderate or moderate high by the landscape schedule, and suggestions are given as to how the limited capacity for rural living development might be realised. The suggestions are encouraging modest scale, strong setbacks from public roads, maintenance of public views across the land, across open land. I consider that the proposal accords closely with the suggestions of the landscape schedule in proposing 2 building platforms that are very well separated and hidden from any public areas. Ms. McPherson generally rates the attributes of the landscape more highly than the landscape schedule does. In these instances, I agree with the notified schedule. Ms. McPherson agrees that visual effects are minimal, except she raises issues regarding public views from Black Peak Road. Black Peak Road is not a public road. It's a private road accessible by a limited number of occupants of the rural living lots. None of these occupants are submitters, and a number of them have given written approval. Ms. McPherson took some issue with the originally proposed earthworks. These have now been significantly reduced in area and volume. The amended proposed earthworks will even out the gradient around the proposed Lot 1 curtilage area in a gentle way that'll be very difficult to notice once regrassing is done. Both Ms. McPherson and the Upper Clutha Environmental Society submission raise issues associated with cumulative effects. In relation to this issue, it's important to note that the landscape schedule sets out that the landscape does have some, very limited, capacity for rural living development, and it gives suggestions as to how this capacity can be realised. The proposal closely follows these suggestions. The smallest lot that the proposal will create is over 9 hectares. The vast majority of the site, i.e. outside the curtilage areas, will remain as open productive land, and development that results from the proposal will be practically imperceivable to the public. So for the above reasons and all the reasons in my evidence, I consider that the proposal accords with the suggestions of the landscape schedule and will appropriately maintain landscape values and visual amenity. So the comments that I thought I'd make about the landscape schedules and the priority areas, I thought it'd be helpful to go to my landscape assessment report, which is part of the application, if that's okay, Commissioners.
Absolutely fine.
And I'm going to paragraph 16 of the assessment report, or maybe 15. And this is just to point out, I'll give you a minute to find that.
Yeah, so we haven't got any tabs, so it's I think it's a page. Oh no, it's it is at page 258 of the agenda.
I think Jane Taylor's right.
Right, yeah.
Just look up where the.
Sorry, you've got that there?
Yes, we have.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so I thought it'd be helpful to go to my paragraphs 15 and 16, probably. In that the relevant objectives and policies relating to landscape issues from the strategic chapters of the plan are in chapters 3 and chapter 6. And those objectives and policies have been final since 2021. So those objectives and policies haven't changed. It's the variation that is now notified purely brings in these landscape schedules. So if we look at those objectives and policies, actually, if we skip down to policy 3.3.33, which is on the bottom of my page there, we can see that these policies always anticipated that the landscape schedules would come along, and they always anticipated that the values identified in those schedules would be maintained or enhanced for rural character landscapes. So none of that has changed. All that's changed is we now have schedules that itemize the values.
Right.
So prior to the variation and prior to the schedules, we always did the same thing. We always identified what the values are and sought to maintain and or enhance them. So the schedules simply help us with that. And if we go through those objectives and policies there, the chapters 3 and chapter 6 ones, I think that's helpful because obviously those objectives and policies sit above, their strategic objectives and policies, and they sit above the rural chapter and the schedules. And so the manner in which we maintain and enhance landscape values as set out in the schedules is guided by these objectives. And in relation to the rural character landscapes, they are about maintaining visual amenity and maintaining landscape character. Interestingly, the first one I've got there, 3218, is a strategic objective of the diversification of land use in rural areas beyond traditional activities, including farming, is enabled, provided that the character and values are maintained. That's an interesting one for me because that wasn't in the operative district plan and it indicates a little bit of a shift. It's an objective is the diversification of land use beyond traditional activities, provided that we maintain the values. So then coming down through those, we've got the rural character landscape one, which is landscape character is maintained, visual amenity values are maintained and enhanced. And then we come down to 3.3.33, which talks about the schedule. And then coming down to the chapter 6, objectives and policies, which are in my paragraph 18. Recognise that subdivision and development is unsuitable in many locations in the rural character landscapes. On balance, we need to be consistent with the objectives and policies. The next one there, have particular regard to potential adverse effects on landscape character and visual amenity values where subdivision would constitute sprawl along roads. These are purely the rural character landscape ones. One about cumulative effects, 6346, avoid adverse effects from development that is highly visible from public places. Well, it forms the foreground of an ONL. So when we're thinking about maintaining and enhancing landscape character and visual amenity values in accordance with the schedule, these objectives and policies really guide us. They sit above the schedule and they show us how we should be maintaining landscape character and visual amenity. And in a rural character landscape, they're recognising that change can occur and the landscape values can still be maintained. The only other extra point I was going to make there is it's actually in paragraph 66 of my evidence, but it refers to a policy 66 of my evidence referring to strategic policy 3344, which just makes it clear that the priority areas are prioritised in terms of timing and that the objectives and policies seek that the schedules for those priority areas are done first. So that policy makes it clear that a priority area isn't prioritised in terms of its landscape merit or its landscape importance or its landscape sensitivity. It's just prioritised in terms of timing to get the schedules done. So that's the only additional points I had. I'm happy to answer questions on my evidence or my report or whatever.
Thank you very much, Ms. Espy. I know Commissioner Sinclair has some questions which probably overlap with mine as well.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Espy. I did have a couple of questions. The one I just wanted to start with was just understanding the earthworks, and I've compared the two documents before and after, and do I understand now that the earthworks are mainly just around lot 1? Oh, yeah, lot 1.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And you've taken away there was on the original plans, there were sort of two main areas. And so one area is completely gone and it seems to be restricted to around the building platform. Is that sort of have I got the right understanding there?
Yes, that's right. That's pretty much correct. The original earthworks involved more earthworks, well, a much larger area on lot 1, spreading over to the east more. The objective there was to grade out the whole paddock area to make it easier topography, really, but that's now been pulled back to more or less being around the curtilage area of lot 1.
Okay. And what impact on topography of the new area, or just of that area around? Will there be an impact on the topography, or is it just, as you say, grading it out to?
Yeah, it covers quite a large surface area, but it's all very shallow earthworks. Okay. And so the terrace that the lot 1 curtilage area sits on will be gently graded out, but it's all quite shallow stuff. And I do make the point somewhere that earthworks for cultivation are exempt from the earthworks rules anyway. Now, this isn't actually for cultivation, although very similar earthworks probably would be done if you were to cultivate that whole paddock. So it'll grade it out, it'll be regrassed, but it won't change the landform essentially.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was on curtilage sizes, and just understanding. I thought I read in a condition that there was sort of a smaller curtilage area, like a domestic curtilage area around the building platform, and then there's a wider curtilage area. Have I got that correct? Or is it just the one curtilage area that covers everything and there's no specifics between the smaller and larger?
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, it's just the one curtilage area. And I believe the condition just refers to the one curtilage area.
Okay.
And essentially the condition is requiring that any domestic outdoor activity, including mowed lawns and things, has to be inside the curtilage area. I wouldn't really anticipate that somebody would actually create a garden that takes up the whole curtilage area. It may take up a small part of it, but the condition prevents it from happening outside the curtilage area, I guess.
Okay. And in terms of sizes of the curtilage area, do you sort of see that's a common size, or is this one larger or than you've seen in the past?
Well, they vary a lot, really. I guess in this instance, the size of the curtilage areas has sort of been guided by visibility of the site and visual effects, and there's nothing really to be lost by making them large as opposed to small here, I think. As I say, I don't anticipate that anyone would actually cover their whole curtilage area in domestic activities. It'd be practically impossible, really, but the condition is just ensuring that the area outside the curtilage area can't have any domestic activities in it.
Okay. Do you think that there's anything that could be tightened on the conditions proposed in terms of spreading out, like a future owner's use of a trampoline, getting right out on the extremities of those areas? Or do you think there's anything that we need to think about there in terms of the extent of the curtilage, in terms of controlling those sort of domestic activities?
Well, I guess I think the condition, from memory, I haven't got it in front of me, but from memory, the condition covers everything, I think. I suppose the only question is the size of them. I mean, I couldn't see any actual effect that would occur by having them this size as opposed to a smaller size, but certainly I'm sure there's, in practical terms, they could be reduced.
Just another one on curtilage. Just on lot 3 in the existing house, there's no curtilage area proposed around that. Is that something that was considered, or is that something you think is required?
Well, that's deliberate, I think. The idea is that outside of proposed lot 1 and proposed lot 2, the site will really remain completely status quo. So whatever somebody can do now, they can do in the event that this consent is granted as well. Having said that, there's a nice established garden there. I can't imagine that being really changed or removed for any reason.
Oh, and I just wanted your advice on the design controls. I see that we've just limited with the condition to really just height, and you've made the comment that that is because of the rules now in the PDP. Is is that sort of the common approach now, that sort of we're relying on the rule rather than putting in a cladding and a colour and all those specifics that we usually see?
Yeah, that's right. That is becoming the norm now, since they're in the district plan. And if somebody comes along and proposes a building that breaches any of those standards to do with reflectivity or whatever it may be, then they have to come back to the council for an extra consent. So it sort of polices it that way.
Oh, and the only question I had left was also back to lot 3 in the existing house and the existing planting. There was no sort of protection over any of that planting that sort of screens that dwelling, and anything there that we need to look at?
Well, again, I think the thinking was that will remain absolutely status quo, and nothing will be protected in a way that's different to the current situation, and nothing will be removed in a way that's different to the current situation. So, I don't think there's any actual environmental effect there. Having said that, I can't imagine anyone will remove the garden and the trees that are there, so it's a possibility.
Well, that was all I had, Mr. Espy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Espy. Actually, Commissioner Sinclair's covered my questions as well, so I don't have any further questions, actually, I think, but just to thank you for your very comprehensive assessment and evidence as well. It's been really helpful.
Thank you.
We'll finish off the applicant's case with Mr. Devlin.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
I will commence just with running through my summary of evidence and then happy to take questions. I've got a few notes also from your earlier questions which I can talk to.
Thank you.
So just with regard to my summary statement, I'll start at paragraph 3B. Since notification, a number of changes have been made to the application to address the landscape peer review comments. These changes include a reduction in the size of curtilage areas, changing the shape of the curtilage areas by pulling them back from the terrace edge, changes to the mix of planting proposed on lot 2, changes to the amenity deciduous trees proposed south of lot 2 to also include evergreen species, and as we've talked about, significant reductions in the extent and volume of earthworks. The site is within the rural zone of the PDP and is included within the rural character landscape, and the site is zoned rural general under the operative district plan. The proposal requires a discretionary activity consent under the PDP. No consent is required under the ODP as no rules are triggered, and consent is not required under the National Environmental Standard for Contaminated Land. Otago Regional Council consent for residential earthworks has been obtained. Farming activity and earthworks of up to 1,000 cubic metres are permitted activities in the rural zone. Therefore, a permitted baseline with regard to farming and earthworks is applicable to the proposal. I appreciate that the council has a choice, or you as commissioners have a choice to make there as to whether to apply the permitted baseline. I do think it is relevant. The proposed district plan is relatively generous with the permitted volume of earthworks, so modification of landform through earthworks is anticipated by the plan. So in my view, it's appropriate to apply a permitted baseline. The effects of the amended proposal in relation to access and traffic, natural hazards, earthwork servicing and reverse sensitivity are agreed between Ms. Gathercole and myself as being acceptable. The remaining areas of disagreement relate to the effects on landscape quality and character, including the extent of earthworks. cumulative effects and visual amenity effects. For the matters above, I prefer the evidence of Mr. Espy on the revised proposal, as he has worked through the landscape schedule and has considered his initial assessment report conclusions against the landscape schedule of landscape attributes. Mr. Espy's assessment aligns well with the independent assessment that was carried out to inform the priority area schedule 21-23-1, and he considers the proposal reflects the intentions of the landscape schedule. I accept the evidence of Mr. Espy that the proposal will add to the existing rural living, but in a particularly subtle and hidden way. As has been discussed, rural living activity that results from the proposal will be practically imperceivable to the public, and public perception of the land will remain as it is now. I have assessed the proposal against the relevant objectives and policies and found that the proposal is consistent and not contrary with the relevant chapters of the PDP. Where there are differences of opinion between myself and Ms. Gathercole, it is primarily due to my preference for Mr. Espy's assessment, and that's because his evidence was based on the revised proposal, and he notes that Ms. McPherson has generally rated the attributes of the landscape more highly than the notified landscape schedule has. In my assessment of the proposal against the national policy statement for highly productive land, I found the proposal is consistent with some parts, neutral with others, and inconsistent with one part of the NPS HPL policies. While the proposal is a subdivision and development located on land partly mapped as LUC3, I considered it is covered by the exemption in clause 381A of the NPS HPL. I consider this the case because parts of the site are a mixture of LUC3 and 4, and the NPS HPL does not apply to the whole site. And the proposed allotments remain capable of maintaining the existing level of primary production, hobby farming, and will retain the overall productive capacity of the subject land. I've assessed the proposal against other higher order planning documents and found the proposal is consistent with and not contrary with the National Policy Statement on Electricity Transmission 2008 and the partially operative and proposed regional policy statements. I have reviewed the Section 42A report and consider the key difference between my planning opinion and that of Ms. Gathercole relates to the landscape character and visual effects assessment. I prefer Mr. Espy's assessment because his evidence is based on has had the benefit of being based on the revised proposal, and he notes that Ms. McPherson has generally rated the attributes of the landscape more highly than the notified landscape schedule does. I have read the submission by Upper Clutha Environment Society Incorporated and have covered the points raised in my evidence. Overall, I consider the actual and potential effects will be appropriate and the proposal is consistent with the purpose of the RMA. Proposed conditions are appended to my evidence of 14 December.
Thank you.
And just to briefly note a couple of points there. There wasn't a set of conditions with the 42A report, and so I did put some together, but through the chair, I wouldn't mind working with Mr. Woodford on those just to fine tune them a little.
Yes, we were going to ask for that at the end of the hearing, so yes, that's very appropriate. And actually, I was going to raise that actually. But you're right, there weren't any answer in the bundle that we had, so I wasn't sure whether the council had actually considered those. I mean, there are some, I think,
there's some in Mr. Devlin's evidence.
Yes.
Yes, I used the RM engineering conditions plus our own volunteered consent notice conditions to come up with a set, but in preparing for this hearing, I realised we omitted to include the environmental management plan conditions. We submitted a EMP up front with this application, and it's the same one that was used for the original consent. So
noticed that in the documents. So yes, so that could, yeah, okay, that can be. We could come back to that perhaps at the end of the hearing.
Great. Just one comment in relation to a question that came up about the Timu subdivision.
Yes.
I have read that decision a little while ago that you as commissioners prepared, and I've also got a copy of the consent order that was issued. I don't know what changed between the consent application that was heard and the consent order, and whether there were amendments made that addressed, the commissioner concerns that led to refusal. But in paragraph 170 of my evidence, I have talked about the Timu decision and why I think it's quite different to this application. And there's 4 reasons really. The Timu application was re-subdividing a site that had already been subdivided for rural living purposes, and that's not the case here. So there was already quite a bit of rural living activity on that lower terrace. The proposed lots were much smaller, being 3.28 and 1.72 hectares, which is consistent with a rural lifestyle zoning. In the rural lifestyle zone, it's a 1 hectare minimum, 2 hectare average. So that's what they were proposing. I think our lots are obviously much larger, 9.1, 9.1 and 17.4 hectares. So I think that's quite a difference to the Timu application. With the Timu application, there were also submissions received in opposition from neighbouring landowners. That's not the case here, where 5 of the 6 directly adjoining landowners have given effective party approval, and the 6th obviously hasn't submitted either. And then obviously since the Timu decision, we've heard about these priority area schedules coming out, and we've had the benefit since then, I guess. Mr. Espy's been able to work through those schedules and confirmed the proposal gives effect to the attributes as described in the landscape. And when that Timu application was determined, those schedules hadn't been notified. So appreciate you're the commissioners on that one, and I did want to set out in my evidence why I felt this proposal was different to that. So
Yes, thank you.
So I had some other notes, but I'm happy to just take questions really. I can actually, maybe I start with the volunteered consent notice conditions.
Yes.
Yep. So in response to a further information request dated 17th of May, I attached an updated set of volunteered consent notice conditions. And I'm not sure if you're able to access them readily.
Yes.
Further information we received.
So there is a volunteered consent notice condition that reads, and I will read it out. All domestic landscaping and structures, including but not limited to clotheslines, outdoor seating areas, pergolas, external lighting, amenity gardens, spa pools, children's play equipment, barbecues, tents, and temporary shelters, containers, water tanks, parked and stored vehicles, including caravans, trailers, boats, and mown lawns, shall be confined to the domestic curtilage area only as shown on the structural landscape plan. And it goes on to say all new fencing shall be standard post and wire, including rabbit-proof fencing. So just to highlight 2 points in that rather long list of things. Amenity gardens and mown lawns are to be confined to the domestic curtilage areas. So that may give you some clarification, Commissioner Sinclair, just with regard to whether the whole property could be domesticated. It couldn't be with that consent notice condition. It does need to be contained to the domestic curtilage area.
Mr. Devlin, is the domestic curtilage area defined anywhere or shown?
Yes, on the
Is it the whole curtilage area?
So on the updated structural landscape plan that was attached to Mr. Espy's evidence.
But it means the whole curtilage area. Is that what you call the domestic curtilage area?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
so yeah.
It is just labelled as curtilage area on the...
Okay. Maybe that's where I was getting confused. I thought there might have been a domestic area within the curtilage area.
Yeah, in my mind, it's the curtilage area associated with the residential use, which is the domestic sort of area. So
okay, thank you.
So that may answer your question earlier about the curtilage areas. And just to also note that the area outside the curtilage area, will have to be maintained in some shape or form through grazing or cropping or something, because the grass, if just left alone, can create a fire hazard. So I think it's unlikely that someone's going to buy a 9 hectare lot and, leave it, or unlikely that they would either domesticate the entire 9 hectares or leave the area outside the curtilage area unmown or ungrazed to manage the fire hazard from the grass.
Right.
Now, Mr. Devon, is there any condition around that about areas use outside the curtilage area in the volunteered set? I couldn't see.
No, we haven't tried to sort of regulate that. We've deliberately left that, deliberately been silent on that. So yeah, future owners will, we haven't proposed, pastoral farming areas or anything like that.
Okay.
Mr. Devon, questions.
Oh, yeah, I've got a couple.
I've just asked one. This is probably just a paragraph 47 of your pre-circulated evidence. You say the proposal is a permitted activity under the ODP. The NES CLN requires a discretion. Is that correct? Is it permitted under the ODP?
Only by virtue of that section of the RMA which says that any rule that is treated as operative any previous rule must be treated as inoperative. So 86F, isn't it? So yeah, normally it would trigger ODP rules, but
yes,
all the equivalent rules under the PDP are beyond challenge, so they're treated as operative and any previous ones as inoperative. So.
Right. Okay. Now I understand that. Just when I saw permitted activity, I was just a bit confused. But no,
it definitely previously was a discretionary activity under the ODP, but but effectively the ODP doesn't apply. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'll pass back to
you. Thanks, Mr. Devlin. Just back onto the ODP. Now that we have no rules. Do we have to look at the objectives and policies and the assessment matters still? Yes. At what stage can we separate those off if there's no rules triggered?
Yeah, my view on that is if there's no rules triggered, you've got, there's nothing to apply the ODP objectives and policies to. So my understanding is they are listed under 104 as things to be considered. So I've considered them in my assessment. I've worked through them all, but my understanding is that they should be given very limited weight now because there are no rules by which to implement those objectives and policies.
I apologise for jumping in, but we've cited a few cases in the written legal submissions from the Environment Court that support Mr. Devlin's view.
Yes. Yes, actually there was one quite recent one, wasn't there? I think Ms. Hockley, which I was actually going to perhaps ask if you could supply a copy of that case. I think it was a 2021. So I'll find it.
Certainly, that may have been the Gibson Vines case.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Supplied the PDP. Yes, we can supply a copy. I think that's cited an earlier case, so we'll supply both.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Devlin, just a couple of other little questions. The first one is I just want to understand, I saw Ms. Hockley had said that visual amenity effects weren't in dispute, but then you've just told me that in your summary that there still is an issue there. I just wondered what that issue was.
I guess in my paragraph 3G, I guess I included that under the broader heading of landscape related matters. So yes, you're correct that Ms. Gathercole was comfortable with the visual amenity effects. So I viewed that as a component of the landscape discussion.
Okay, My second question was back to the questions I was asking Mr. Espes, just on the design control, and you've obviously have the same. I don't put words in your mouth. Do you have the same opinion that we now rely on the PDP? Is there anything else that we should be considering in terms of what goes into a design control condition?
Yes, we sort of grappled with this when I guess those PDP rules had legal effect, and I think the practice is now that rather than duplicating things through consent notice conditions, as Mr. Espy mentioned, there's a consent trigger there. If you don't meet those colours, materials, reflectivity requirements, you need another resource consent, which is quite a strong incentive not to, to meet the requirements. Our practice in the office, at least, has been to not duplicate those rules from the PDP through consent notices and just rely on the district plan. There is a good safety check there with the building consent process where QRDC check every building consent, and that will pick up anyone who's not meeting the colours and material requirements. And so yes, we don't think we need to duplicate those provisions through consent notices.
Okay, thank you. And just the other question was on back onto the Timu subdivision. Just from your knowledge of it, it's been a while since Commissioner Taylor and I looked at that. I recall that Upper Clutha Environmental Society were involved in that application. And do you know if they withdrew from being party to appeal or were not parties to the appeal? I just wanted to understand if you knew that. If you don't, it's fine. We can find that out.
No, I'm not sure, sorry. I do have a copy of the consent order here. Their name might be on the front of it. I can just quickly check that. It won't take a...
Fred McElroy was the problem.
Mr. Farrant's advised me that Upper Clutha pulled out.
I think so.
Yeah.
Fred McElroy was the problem.
It was just the neighbour, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That was all I had, Mr. Devlin. Thank you.
All right, well, unless there's any other questions, that's the applicant's case.
Thank you, Ms. Hockley. I don't think I had. Sorry, I'm just running through I've just written some comments here on Mr. Devlin's pre-circulated evidence, but I think we've actually touched on everything that I highlighted. So, no, thank you. That's, thank you very much. Really appreciate the very thorough evidence that's before us. It's been really helpful. So I think at this stage then it's 1 o'clock. Are you happy, Ms. Hockley and your team, with a half-hour lunch adjournment, or would you like longer?
Half an hour will be fine. I should just note Mr. Farrant will have to leave now. He's got a plane to catch.
Oh, that's right.
Oh, right. Yes, no, that's absolutely fine. Thank you very much, Mr. Farrant.
Thank you, Mr. Farrant.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
When I was burbling on. Thank you.
No, that was good. It was a good discussion. Thank you very much. All right. Well, we'll reconvene at about 12. 1:30ish. That'd be great. Just after 1:30. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, everyone. I think we're all here. Oh, thank you, Trish. So let's resume the hearing, and Mr. Woodford, I'll pass over to you for Council's response at this stage.
Thank you. We'll just run through some minor engineering issues with Ms. Overton first. Then we'll go to Mr. McPherson, and then I'll I guess mop up whatever else needs to be mopped up at the end. So we can go to Ms. Overton first, I think.
Good afternoon, Ms. Overton.
Hi. I just had, there was just one query, and that was in regards to telecommunications. At the time I wrote my report, I was on the understanding that cell coverage was going to be undertaken and that there were going to be no landlines installed, because Chorus confirmed that the only option was copper, and it's probably not worth the money and effort to install that for what you'd get in return. I did note that Mr. Devlin had included a telecommunications connection in his offered conditions. I wasn't sure if that was still going ahead, but in the event that we aren't providing a telecommunications connection, I recommend that they have an easement over access lot 4.
Right.
So that in the event, it's just much easier to create these easements now during the subdivision than it would be later in the event that they wanted to.
And in the event that there was no no cell coverage or a satellite.
Yes, well, in the event, I was thinking sort of forward thinking in the event that fibre eventually gets installed within Morris Road.
I was thinking, I was just going to ask you about that. So there is no fibre at the moment?
No, not that I understand, not.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, shall I, probably appropriate then to go to you, Ms. Hockley, and just ask what the position is.
Yes, I might hand over to Mr. Devlin. We did discuss this at lunch. He's got a response for you.
Obviously, Southern Land wrote our infrastructure report, so
yes.
Just answering as best I can. But the application was put forward on the basis of having a fixed physical connection. But as Ms. Overton notes, the letter we had from Chorus said, yeah, it's going to be pretty slow. It's not a broadband speed connection. It would just be a voice, effectively phone line, and I guess copper. So we did, in the further information response, look at the mobile data maps to see what the upload speeds were like for that part. You know, it is just outside yes. Wanaka, and from memory, the mobile data speeds were better. I can't quite recall what they were. Sorry. I don't think we've ever formally sought to just have mobile phone connections. The application before you does refer to a fixed landline connection, but we acknowledge that the speeds are pretty poor, so it might be both.
Right.
And just one final matter was on the plan of subdivision for the access lot 4. It does have right of an easement labelled C on it there, which is right to convey electricity and telecommunications. So I think that answers the final part of the question, which was, is there an easement in lot 4 for telecommunications? And I believe there's one there shown on the schedule of easements. So, so hopefully that answers your question.
Well, that's yes. Thank you. Is that? Have you had a look at that one, Ms. Overton? Is that on the? Because normally they would have a right to convey, if there's an easement there, a right to convey both.
I wasn't sure if that went for the whole length of the access 4, or whether it was just.
Yeah, I believe it's all of lot 4.
Okay.
Yeah, for example, D you can see is defined more closely. It looks like a cable crosses it there or something. But yeah, my understanding is that easement C, that's sort of right in the middle, would cover all of, so it's lot 4 serving lots 1 and 2. So yeah, I think we're all good there with the telecoms easement.
Okay. Perhaps that's something you could address in the reply as well.
Yeah.
I
think through the chair, I think Ms. Overton's question is really, are we still going to seek a fixed line connection given the poor speeds? And yeah, if we could come back to you on that in the right of reply, that would be helpful.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think Ms. Overton, what I'm hearing you saying, and I've had this in previous applications, is all as if there is no fixed line being proposed, then having for someone owning that property to then have a right to actually put one in if everything else failed for whatever reason is the compromise. I haven't had for telecoms, actually mainly for electricity if someone wants to go off grid.
Right.
So
great.
Is that what I understand? Yeah. Your concern? Yeah. Just to...
Yes, that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, because I totally understand that you know, if the application proceeds, that the owners of those lots may not wish to put an old landline style, especially if it's got terrible speeds. And there's other options. I don't know whether Wanaka has access to something like the light speed, but I know in the Queenstown Valley there a lot of people are on that they don't have a landline at all at the moment. I mean, they might still have the connection for the copper, but it's not used. So and I think you can even sign up for Elon Musk's Starnet now. My son was busy telling me the other day that was a really good option. I haven't looked at it, but apparently it is available. So there are more options around these days. So I think that's just maybe just internet, but you have your phone over the internet anyway. So yeah. All right, thank you, Miss Overton. Is that all from you then?
Yes, it is. Thank you. Otherwise I just stand by the findings in my report. Nothing to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Overton.
Back to you, Mr. Woodford.
Okay, thank you. We'll just go back to Ms. McPherson now, just to cover off her landscape comments.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great, great. I'm just figuring out where to start here. I support Mr. Eastby's assertion that there are a number of matters which he and I agree upon with regard to the character and of the vicinity and the site's contribution to that character. We agree that it is rural in character, open, and is located on the outwash plain above the river terraces. I did not refer to the landscape schedule when I undertook my memo peer review because I was advised that the section had not progressed far enough down the notification track. However, the schedules have now become part of the conversation, and I would like to comment on them if that's all right, Commissioners.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we were going to ask you that question, so we sort of had assumed that might have been the case.
Right, okay. The schedule for the area identifies the same character elements as Mr. Espy and I both determined, but considered that the landscape is a degree lower in its openness and naturalness than I did. I accept these ratings as set down in the section 2123. These first 29 landscapes that are priority landscapes were considered priorities because of the pressures they were currently under, and as Judge Hassan put it, where the most significant development pressures are anticipated during the life of the district plan. The landscape schedules specify what character and values are required to be maintained. I consider that the subject site contributes to the agricultural land use, the pattern of shelter belts, the sequence of land forms extending from the river, the heritage of pastoral landscapes, the rural edge to Wanaka Township, and the coherence of land use patterns, strong rural character, and low-key tranquility of the area. I consider that in this proposal, the site's landform is to be changed to accommodate the proposed subdivision. A mature shelter belt is proposed for removal. Agricultural activity on the site will be reduced. It does not maintain the character values that are listed in the schedule. It relies upon them. I accept that it is possible to grow some crops or have a few sheep on the proposed subdivided lots, but it is equally possible, for instance, to have a tree-lined driveway, a pet pony, and a few sheds and shelter dotted about the place, hobby farming. Next comes the capacity of this area to tolerate land use change and development and still maintain its character. The scale of capacity in the schedules has 4 tiers: some capacity, limited capacity, very little capacity, and no capacity. It is no surprise that the priority areas all have very limited capacity for rural living, given they were identified as being under pressure from rural living development. As stated in paragraph 3.11 of the Section 32 reports regarding the variation to introduce the schedules, it was noted, where a landscape has no, very limited, or some capacity for development, the schedules alert the plan users to the fact that the landscape is nearing capacity, meaning there is a real threat of cumulative effects from further subdivision and development. Capacity is inextricably tied to the cumulative effects of each development. To my mind, this means for the Upper Clutha that rural character was being reduced by rural living subdivision pressures and the cumulative adverse effects on it. I stand by my opinion that when the landscape of the vicinity is taken into consideration and not just the site, then subdividing this site becomes an additional contributor to the existing subdivision on a valued rural landscape. It lifts the fragmentation of 83 Black Peak Road up on from the lower terrace and reinforces the subdivision that has occurred on the opposite side of Black Peak Road. The area is identified as under pressure from such subdivision and thus is a priority character area and has a capacity definition of very little capacity. I maintain that there are moderate cumulative adverse effects from the changes proposed. With regard to the property area descriptors, Mr. Espy and I agree that the proposal adds to the subdivision and built form on rural land in the vicinity. Further, I consider it modifies the land form through mounding and introduces additional living and domestic areas on open pasture land. I consider that this is not integrating with the landform and existing vegetation and is fragmenting the site. It sections off areas that were currently open and rural by the access to lot 1, I think it's to lot 1, and the areas to the sort of southwest of each of the houses and the curtilage areas. Those are now segmented off the main open rural area of the site. There will no doubt be additional letterboxes adjacent to the land crossing, which are noted in the schedule as naturalness in the naturalness attribute section as undermining the working farm rural character. Turning to the PDP, throughout section 3 of the PDP, the injunction pertaining to rural land is the maintenance of the rural character and the maintenance or enhancement of the visual and amenities values of the rural character landscape. The considerations are landscape character to be maintained, which I have discussed above, and visual amenity, from which I accept the information that Black Peak Road is a private road and therefore cannot be considered a public place. I had anyway agreed with Mr. Espy that there were low visual impacts because of the low number of public that would actually be using that road anyway. The fragmentation in built form is present and has adverse landscape effects, whether they are seen or not, which is why landscape character has its own heading. Finally, landscape character, and this is where Mr. Espy and I disagree. In my peer review, I recommended some amendments to the proposal should council planner consider granting consent. I agree that the revised landscape plan achieves most of the concerns that I had, but I did not state that should these recommendations be undertaken, I would then consider the subdivision no longer to have cumulative landscape effects. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. Commissioner Sinclair.
I just want to get that clear, that last point you made, Ms. McPherson. So with all the changes that they've made, you still consider that there will be cumulative adverse effects on the landscape character?
I do.
Just a couple of other questions. One is on curtilage area around lot 3. Do you think that's required? Had you considered that?
Yes, I had considered that, but I didn't recommend it at the time because it was an established site and seemed to have one that was defined anyway. But if that's your advice, then I would consider it for the future a good idea. I think it's important to remember that this is a subdivision that will go on for the future. So in that regard, I think it's important.
And I hear your comments on Black Peak Road. I've got that. And earthworks, just wanted to touch base on the earthworks reduction, and Mr. Espy telling us that they would be similar to cultivation in terms of no change to landform, and it was a topsoil scrape. What's your view on those amended earthworks?
I guess that I would say I would defer to him on that, but I would point out that there are also moundings that are proposed on the site. And as I mentioned, the one on lot 2, when combined with the curtilage, shuts off that whole area down the bottom from the rest of the productive land. I don't know if you've noticed, but Mr. Espy has put which existing vegetation is to be retained on his plan.
Yes.
And that doesn't include that big shelter belt that runs diagonally across the site.
I'm just going to go to a plan and if you could just talk us through those two things about the shelter belt cutting off the site. Is that the one?
No. I'm saying that the mound, on lot 2. If you look at the house and the curtilage.
Just get a plan, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Bear with me. Landscape. Yeah. So I'm now looking at the 6th of October plan. So if you can just talk us through the concerns with what you...
Yes, I'm just saying that on lot 2, you've got the building platform and curtilage, sort of shaped like a house really in plan. Yes. And then to the southwest of that, there's a mound, which kind of shuts off that section further southwest. So in there, do you see what I mean? like before the whole of lot 2 and beyond was all open all the way through, but now that piece is shut off. And the same thing happens on lot 1. There's an area that is not part of the curtilage, but is a triangle in the southwest corner that is cut off from the rest of the productive land. And the access way to lot 1 cuts through the remainder of the open rural area.
Oh, right. Okay. So yeah, we're not sure where the access way.
It doesn't show on the structural landscape plan, but it kind of traces a similar line to the track that you can see there.
Right. Oh, okay. So
yeah,
and following that.
And I just wanted to also make sure that you appreciated that the existing vegetation to be retained is listed in the key, and it doesn't include that big shelter belt through across the middle of the site.
Oh, right, with it stretching all the poplars. Is that it? Like, would I see that line or?
It's basically following the line of the boundary.
Okay,
between the 2 lots.
Right, the way
it's
through.
It's a big long shelter belt through there.
Okay.
And I feel like that's one of the cumulative effects of subdividing.
And you see
that it's considered one of the landscape elements of this rural character of these shelter belts. So from that point of view, that's where why I'm talking about it.
Okay, and sorry, Mr. Ferguson, just to the mounding proposed that you say is going to cut off that openness of the site. Is that from, as you would see it, from Black Peak Road?
It's from the I guess if you're looking at the plan, then it's your left-hand corner.
Yes.
And then it's like a triangle up towards that mound on lot 2.
Right, and it's that dotted line.
The dotted line is the mounding. So, and then you've got the curtilage beyond that. So that triangle of land in there is shut down. It's shut down. I don't know what you do with it really.
Yeah, that's the driveways on this one.
Oh, right. Okay.
It's on the earthworks.
On the earthworks plan. Okay. That was all the questions I had, Ms. McPherson. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we had
I had to have some more.
You go.
Sorry, I've swapped. I turned the page, and there are a couple of things. Sorry. Got the curtilage. Design controls. Do you is understanding that we now rely on the rules of the PDP? Do you support that, and is that sort of the current practice that we're seeing now?
I'd defer to Mr. Woodward on that, but my comment would be that they've taken care to specify the height of the buildings rather than run with the district plan.
Okay.
But haven't sort of spoken to the dwellings colours, and I'm not sure where the logic is there. I guess it would be my only comment.
Thank you. I'll ask Mr. Wood for that when I get there. Thank you. That was all I had. I can't find a question.
Okay. So you've answered my questions, Ms. McPherson, on the way through. It was in relation to the priority areas and whether you had assessed those and the weight given. So I think you've covered all of that very well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So back to you, Mr. Woodford.
Thank you. Thank you. Righty, there you go. So I guess I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have of Ms. Gathercole's report. Do you want me to? I can run through sort of my notes from today as I've sort of heard the evidence.
That would be helpful first, yes.
Do that. So. Now, one of the issues I've sort of identified is that what I've heard today is that the applicant's case is flagged that it's under the NES HPL that in section clause 3.8, avoiding subdivision on highly productive land, that clause 1A, the applicant demonstrates that the proposed lots will retain their overall productive capacity of the subject land over the long term. My question is 3.9, which relates, clause 3.9, which relates to highly productive land being protected from inappropriate use and development. Now, I haven't really heard much on that because the building platform, the land and the earthworks are development and also use of the land in question. Now, in order to, so territorial authorities must avoid the inappropriate use or development of highly productive land that is not land-based primary production. The use or development of highly productive land is inappropriate except where at least one of the following applies, and in the subclause 2. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether the applicant wants to pin it on. It could be that it provides for supporting activities of the land. It could be that it is a small scale activity that has no impact on the productive capacity of the land. I'm not entirely sure. One thing I will draw your attention to is that supporting activities on the land are defined. That relates to so in relation to highly productive land means those activities reasonably necessary to support land-based primary production on that land, in brackets, such as on-site processing and packaging or packing, equipment storage and animal housing. So there's sort of ancillary farming production activities, I would say, rather than a residential unit. Curtilage, landscape mounds, those type of things. I don't think those are, you would classify those as supporting activities, but that is perhaps something for the applicant to demonstrate.
Sorry, Mr. Woodford. Mr. Woodford. Where was that? What was that reference? Do we find the on-site processing, packaging?
Oh, sorry, that is on in the it's actually in the document bundle from the applicant. It will be on page 16.
16. Thank you.
16, yeah. So that I guess it brings into question the not just the subdivision, the alignment of boundaries and how that might or might not impact the highly productive land, but also the use of that land. Now we heard from Mr. Farrant that he's growing barley, and that was one of the things that was mentioned. Now required obviously helicopter spraying. Now it may not be something that's proposed on these lots 1 and 2, but I think it would be quite difficult to hover around spraying when you've got a house and curtilage area sort of slap bang in the middle of lot 1 or around lot 2. So I do feel for the applicant. The highly productive land question has sort of I guess taken everyone a bit by surprise. And where traditionally you would look at a site and say, where can I best site my development to not be visible from from certain areas? This highly productive land question adds another layer. So it's not just visual effects. Can you see it? It's actually, where is the best place for this development? Is it 2/3 the way down lot 1, which potentially restricts what you can do around the back, or so you sort of, I was looking before during the break about the surrounding landscapes. Generally farming blocks are ideally me being OCD would be you'd have a rectangle and you have your house in one corner, and then you've got a big you've got a easy to farm land. It's not always the case, but generally you wouldn't really site development in in the center of a site, especially when you're talking about, it is highly productive land, whether it's, whether I guess the background, it's a bit dated, but the fact is it's there, and it has the same class 1, 2, and 3 have exactly the same standing under this NES. So until such time as it potentially it doesn't. So I guess what we've got. So my sort of question for the applicant would be that whether once you take into consideration vehicle accesses, the curtilage areas, mounding, and any planting, whether that is actually is that actually protecting the highly productive land from inappropriate use or development?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it, Mr. Foot? Because I'm going to ask you, how much weight do we give this, bearing in mind Ms. Hockley's submissions that this is based on old plans. It's just I think there is a question in my mind, certainly around, well, if the land is not productive at the moment in that sense of in an economic sense, how would leaving it in its current state assist that? If it's so then you sort of say, well, is there Mr. Farrant's submission was that, well, actually dividing up the land and actually having more landowners with presumably more financial resources to possibly do a little bit more and make that land more productive might actually assist, given that at the moment, and we don't have any evidence from a farm consultant or anything, but I think Mr. Farrant is he's obviously tried. I assume he's tried quite hard to probably manage this as a productive lot, but when we were there were clearly deer fences there, so it has been used for deer farming in the past. So
yes,
so that's my issue with the, I suppose, the HPL is that if land is not productive, and what does that term actually mean, then how do you then suddenly make something productive that really is unless you've got ample irrigation and probably throw a whole lot of money in fertilizer and everything else, and you might run a few more stock units. But even if you look at sheep and beef farming historically, I think the returns on even the good blocks, the highly productive land are quite low, and in a lot of cases are actually 1% or 0. So that's why I think this is really interesting. You can sort of see this application in areas that are used for horticulture at the moment, or cropping, Canterbury Plains, Bombay Hills, those kinds of areas. But how relevant is it here is, I suppose, my question.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to the protection of that land. It's not, it's for a future, there's that future use, and it may not be, what's happened with climate change. It gets warmer. We're looking at the Wakatipu Basin. The number of frost days are going to drop dramatically in the next, maybe not my lifetime, but maybe my kids, and it's going to change things. So it's about ensuring that we don't get you fragment the land, and then it's very hard to bring it back into a productive state. Now, I know that Mr. Farrant had talked about rabbits running over the place. I can only see that getting worse in smaller land holdings. It's quite easy to do a larger land holding. Do you control? Once you start getting, it's a lot harder to shoot rabbits on properties, or poison or what have you, when you've got dogs and whatever. And I know it's a family subdivision at the moment. Doesn't mean to say that that's always going to be the case. So
but they are 9 hectare lots though, so I'm not sure I'd agree with you on that. But, I think I totally agree when you get right down to very small lots, but you know, 9 hectares is still quite a sizable chunk of land for control purposes. I mean, and actually, we did notice on our site visit that it is actually rabbit fenced, the entire block.
It's just one of those things that once you know, smaller sizes, it does, you know, economies of scale, isn't that? So now one of the, I did read in the Southern Land Servicing report a mention of bore water for domestic supply, stock and irrigation. Now, I just want to bring to your attention that in discussions with the regional council this morning, the aquifer that the land.
Oh, we've gone on to mute, sorry. Still on mute.
Sorry about that.
That's better.
Leave that there. Not sure where I got up to. This morning I was in consultation with the regional council, and it's just in regards to the servicing of the sites, lots 1 and 2. The Southern Land report mentions that a bore would be located on each site for domestic stock and irrigation water. Now that the aquifer where the land sits over or under, whatever, is fully allocated. The applicant actually has a water permit to take groundwater, which is located on lot 3. So there, I guess there is the potential that that water could be reallocated to within the aquifer, subject to you know, that does require approval from the regional council to make sure it's not, the drawdown doesn't adversely affect other lawful takes in the area. But again, it is an issue that I think possibly needs addressing. That if once you break up that land, and if you're relying on water to be taken on the proposed lots, if it's not available to be obtained, you have then further restricted the future productivity of that land, because then you won't have any irrigation or potential irrigation.
So this is irrigation water, not potable.
Correct. So crops and things like that would or may require, if that was, you know, barley requires water, you know, so it's just one of those things to note. It's possibly you know, not insurmountable, but again, it's something that should be sort of covered off to give certainty that you know, this can happen and that, you know, it can remain productive. I know I'm well aware of the water permit issue, the mining privilege issue. We dealt with that, the regional council in 2000, and 2021 or whatever seemed far away at the time.
It's come around really quickly.
Come and gone, and no surprises. Things have been sort of pushed on down the road a bit by the regional council. So, but yeah, that is you know, I'm not entirely sure if the applicant actually has a priority on that water ass. They're at the end of it, but whether or not they actually have the right to take it before other people, that is a matter that perhaps needs, because, you know, just because you're on it, you have a water race running through your property doesn't mean to say you're the only, if you're the end of the race, that you are the last one to take it. There are priorities, but I'm unaware of what that might be. It's just something to bear in mind when it comes to, you know, the water. Let's see, coolage areas. Yeah, I did you know, take on board that Mr. Farrant had talked, you know, couldn't sort of, you know, distinguish between one type of soil and the other, or, no, I wasn't too sure if that was actual soil or the productivity between the class 3 and class 4. That wasn't entirely clear. So it may be, you know, I guess, and that's I guess the question is, we've got it, that's what's mapped, that's what it is. and it could be worse than that. It could be better than that. But I guess we just have to work with the classifications that we've got. So, for example, lot 2 at approximately 4.3 hectares within class 3, it would appear that there's round about, might be getting, well, potentially a hectare that's of that class 3 that would be removed by curtilage or just general proximity. It's just, you know, there's mounding, there's planting in that bottom corner. So there's quite a chunk that's removed from that. Same goes with lot 1. You've got 9.914 hectares of land. There'll be at least a hectare of either curtilage, mounding, planting, and then on top of that, you've got your vehicle access that runs through it. So there is a loss of productive land, or class 3, as part of this. So it's yeah. So I'd say that, you know, that's your development of use and development of the land, as opposed necessarily to the subdivision and the lot arrangements and that. This is I think a critical aspect that needs to be explored a bit with regard to you know, how does it fit those exemptions in 3.9.
Yes, the 3.9 clause.
Maybe that is to find. Now I know that we've got some. There's, I guess I can address the conditions, letting the PDP, you know, standards. Do we need to propose any conditions like that as a consent notice? Now, I did raise during the break with Ms. McPherson that, you know, there are height controls proposed. Obviously, everything's on a site by site, case by case basis. So I thoroughly recommend that if the consent is granted, there is a height control, because that's actually something that's been assessed on the site. With regards to colours, materials, I do take a sort of pragmatic approach. Unless there's something that's you really want to hide it away, in terms of you know, and those other ONLs, reasonably difficult to see type of issues, then I think the colours and materials type of question, we can use the plan just to I guess take the wheel, and just ensure that, because those are what's anticipated by the plan. Bearing in mind, it's a pretty broad brush when it looks to, you know, the rural zone, but I think the key for me would be height. Height and location, I guess, is the key, and then beyond that, assuming, you know, that they can meet those standards, then you know, the key issues have been addressed. I found it interesting, the discussion about the potential consent notices or restrictions or encouragement for maintaining production on the site. They can be very problematic when it would force someone to do something beyond, you know, like I think Mr. Farrant said, you know, growing carrots.
Yes.
I have come across that in north of Auckland, where, you know, people are required to grow grapes. There's no one can take the grapes, but they're required to take them, you know, grow them, and it just causes no end of headaches. So I would think that the easiest way to ensure that something is done on the land would be that is very clear as to what you can do in your curtilage, your building platform, and then making sure that, you know, for example, there's no mowing of land, or, you know, sort of manicuring, landscaping or what have you outside of that area. That might come into play with regards to the bunding. I'm not sure how that gets, you know, you don't want to create a rod for your back on that one. But, you know, just making sure that there's no, you know, if it's pasture, it's basically retained in that. That there might be restrictions, for example, on, you know, the driveway plantings or something like that. I don't know. That's just to make sure that there's not, it doesn't become this wooded allotment. Is can be, you know, if people can't be bothered to grow things, then we don't actually encourage, you know, or we have to ensure that there is some mechanism then that what plantings are on site are contained within the curtilage. Beyond that, it could just become a wooded, you know, allotment. But yeah, that would be my.
So what you're sort of suggesting then is that, so you would define the curtilage, what activities could occur on the curtilage, and I think Mr. Espy was sort of explaining this, and then the condition would provide that those activities must be within that curtilage area, and by extension cannot be on the balanced land, and so it's more of a negative control than a.
I think so, yeah, but it's also making clear in any sort of restriction like that in the curtilage, that perhaps there's an advice note for the avoidance of doubt. This is what we mean for the remainder of the site. It's not so much a condition, but it's providing guidance. And any time, I'm sure we can all agree that the more background to a condition or requirement, the better. And it just means that there's no one's going to slip up down the track.
Yeah, no.
I mean, it causes problems.
Yes. Yes, no, I totally understand. I think that's a very good point. And I mean, in the past, they have been used to say things like the area must be maintained in grazing, but, you know, that's not, we're talking about, you know, sort of, I guess, the ability for the landowner to actually maximise the productivity of the land by whatever. It might be carrots, or it could be grapes, or it could be, you know, so you don't want to have restrictions around that, as long as it's fits within the, I suppose, the uses that you would anticipate in this area, I think.
Yeah. I think just probably possibly on those conditions, yeah, absolutely happy to work through any conditions. It's normally something that would be upfront, but, you know, there's EMP conditions which would, you know, be required. Just to work through that, I'm more than happy to do that. ODP objectives and policies, you know, that they're still live, they still exist. It's only the rules that are treated as inoperative. I think that they need to be considered, but, and you know, given, like as Mr. Devon said, you know, there's no rule trigger as such. It'd be, you know, limited weight, is how I'd see that. See that playing out. And yeah, I was just going through the objectives and policies assessment from Mr. Gathercole and the whether something, you know, contrary or inconsistent. Now I didn't get a full chance during the break to tick off everyone, but generally the way I see this proposal, from what I've heard today, I'm of the view that those contraries are, you know, given is it word? You know, is it repugnant? No, I don't.
Oh, you've gone on mute again, Miss. Sorry.
Right. I'm not sure what happened to the other. There we go.
Must be very touchy.
Yeah.
So sorry, you were saying that it's not repugnant, I think was what
I don't share the same view. That I think inconsistent. But I haven't gone through and done a full rules assessment. But I think Ms. Hockley was correct in the way we're looking at it. What is contrary? What does it mean? How should it be applied? I don't see it as being contrary to those relevant objectives and policies, but are definitely inconsistent with. I'd say it is a there are those cumulative landscape effects as Ms. McPherson has mentioned. So I still agree on that point, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that they're contrary.
Yeah.
And I think that might be. I think. Yes, so happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Wood. Well, actually, I think you've picked up on most of my questions, but one that you didn't touch on was just the relevance of the consent order for Timu and whether that has any sort of inference by way of a precedent effect. Given that we are talking the same zone, we're talking a rural landscape character.
I think it does. It is. That is the environment that we're in. So yeah, I do think it is relevant.
And what can you elaborate on that? Sorry.
Sorry. Well, I don't think you can you can't break up the zone, the RCL into little discrete pockets. I think there is that sort of precedent effect that there can be. Now I haven't really read too much into the consent order, but I think there's definite precedent effects for that as consented, that it could be applied elsewhere in the area.
Right. Okay.
I've just got two questions. The rest of them have been answered, so thank you. My two questions were, you just mentioned before about the ODP saying the objectives and policies are still live. Where do the assessment matters of the ODP fit? Can they be forgotten about, or are they still live as well?
I would say they would be, they relate to the rule, so I would say no.
Okay, great, thank you. And my last question was just more about the approach in terms of consistency with the NPS and the HPL. How's council handling it for other rural subdivisions? Is there a sort of a process of more evidence required on the soils? Has that been an issue that's been coming up? For applicants to demonstrate the productivity?
Like I say, I feel for applicants and everything that's been sort of lumped with it. Where I'm dealing with it at the moment, it's certainly going to be a further information request and getting an expert comment on what effect. Well, no, it's something that needs to be front-footed by the applicant, ideally. If not, then we have to ask that question, where does it sit, and sort of probe those productive uses up front. And depending on the response, it could be that there are long-term constraints. That's not the case in this application, it would appear, but if there was, well then that would potentially need a peer review to make sure that those, just like landscape, those assumptions and recommendations or whatever are consistent. So it's bit of a steep learning curve for all involved, but we are, I think, just making sure that we're getting the best information up front, ideally before we turn up to a hearing. But that's where we are. But yeah, it's certainly going to be questions raised with applicants, and seeing exactly where it fits in, and then if there is that exemption, what, especially if they're going to rely on the number of clauses. There's a 3.10, which definitely relates to exploring all your options and different land management strategies and all those things. They all have to be sort of ticked off as you go through if there is an exemption. Now, in this case, we're not looking at that. We're looking at, is it one of the measures, use development, in 3.9, and it ticks off between A to J, and then so that those ones are a little bit easier to assess in some regards. But yeah, I guess short answer, it's moving feast, but we are looking to get more and more information from applicants as to where things sit, and it's a difficult one, especially there's very few large, super productive, economically viable type developments, land holdings out there. So what we're dealing with is productive land that, or as mapped, that is currently mapped, that, traditionally hobby farming, and that's sort of where we're at. So that I don't envy your role at all, but it's something that I guess we've got the NPS, and it's there about protection of that resource, and just making sure that whatever development is there is actually protected for future use.
Yeah, that's yes. So that's back to our earlier discussion, isn't it? I think you've summed it up quite well. Your comment there about protection of future use.
Protection of the resource for future use.
Yeah, resource for future use is something that needs to be considered.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's probably all my. I always ask this question at the end, as you know, Mr. Woodford. But have you, given what you've heard today, have you changed, or would you change the recommendation? Sorry, because it wasn't your recommendation to start with.
No. I wouldn't change my recommendation. But I do think that I don't see it being contrary to those relevant PDP objectives and policies. But I still think there is a cumulative effect.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Woodford. Very helpful.
I shall mute, hopefully, on purpose this time.
Thank you. Well, I'll hand back to you, Ms. Hockley. So I'm assuming you will want to file a reply in writing to address the issues that have arisen during the hearing.
Yes, there are a few points that would be quite helpful, I think, for us to give a little bit of thought to and address in writing, and that response could come at the same time as a agreed set of conditions between Mr. Woodford and Mr. Devlin.
That would be really helpful if there could be an agreed set of conditions. So what sort of time frame would you like for the reply?
Generally, I do like to ask for around 10 days if possible, but I thought it might help checking with Mr. Woodford in terms of his capacity of working on those conditions as well.
Yes, good point, because it is a busy time of the year. So are you happy with 10 days, Mr. Woodford?
Yeah, I'd like to get it done before Christmas. So, yep.
Yes, no, exactly. All right, so that would take us to, what are we now? Friday
17th,
week, isn't that
yeah.
right? Because it's Tuesday. lost track of the days already this week. It's Tuesday. So
Friday week, that's the 9th.
Yes, or would you
just thinking that through, perhaps the Monday after that.
Yes.
The 9th is quite a busy day for us.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Be,
Monday the 12th.
Yes, that would be perfect.
Okay, so we'll say close of the day on Monday the 12th. If you need any more time, please feel free to just come back and ask for an extension, because obviously this is in the applicant's hands. So, and we, best will in the world, between now and Christmas, I don't think we'd be able to issue a decision in that timeframe, but I would say we would probably be able to give a verbal indication of what the decision would be, if that was helpful, because I think at that point there'll only be probably less than 10 working days left of the year, actually. I'm not sure.
Yes, I think you're correct. That would be helpful. Perhaps we can address that at the time.
Yes. So we could just see how we go on it. But I know Commissioner Sinclair and I are both away on leave around about the 17th. So probably for us, it wouldn't probably give us enough time to actually write the decision, but we are intending to deliberate during that time frame anyway. And in this particular application, the issues are, quite discrete as we've been through today. So we're not dealing with something very long and complex.
Yes.
Although that's not to say that the discrete issues aren't complex, because we're dealing with two novel areas, but those are the issues essentially. So everything else I think is agreed between council and the applicant. So
yes, that's correct.
Yeah. All right. We will then adjourn the hearing on that basis, and I'd just like to thank you all very much for the superb quality of the evidence and the legal submissions. That's all been incredibly helpful for us and to council officers as well, for your evidence and your contribution today. That's been helpful as well. It's great to have that sort of discussion and actually get all the points of view out on the table. So we're really grateful for that. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy the afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you.
See you later.